All right, guys and gals, so go ahead and get started again here and kind of resume our discussion from the earliest years of the 20th century, the 1900s. We were talking about some key figures. John D. Rockefeller making a ton of money, Standard Oil, and his son John D. Rockefeller Jr. getting lined up to be a major force in American land conservation and preservation with the advent of the National Park Service and needing to get that all organized in a way that Congress could kind of catch up to. So, just as a quick reminder before we jump back into it, we are kind of setting ourselves up to take a quiz coming up probably today's Thursday, so maybe Tuesday's class session, and it's that one question, pretty open-ended quiz of compare and contrast any previous historic era of human forest outdoor recreation and leisure versus today. How are they the same? How are they kind of different? So pretty open-ended. You can pick any particular chunk out of history and do that. It won't be a super long quiz, so you might want to think about what kind of answers you'd record for that in anticipation of it. Okay? So hopefully today we can get through the 20th century and get us to things as they are today and get us all set up for Tuesday's quiz. Okay, so we were talking about how John Muir versus Gifford Pinchot, kind of this big conservation versus preservation debate. How do we want to take care of our land and use our land as a country? And we kind of left the narrative with John Muir die brokenhearted because this guy, not him, but this guy, Teddy Roosevelt, essentially picked sides with Gifford Pinchot, and Gifford Pinchot helped set up the United States Forest Service. But in the long run, John Muir's efforts to get the idea of preservation for its own benefit into the minds of the American public, he was actually way more successful, had a much longer reach than Gifford Pinchot ever managed with the Forest Service. And even 50 years after his death, as we're getting into legislation in the mid-1960s, John Muir's ideas and principles helped pave the way for, as it turns out, ironically, a whole bunch of people in the Forest Service to argue for the establishment of federally designated wilderness. But that's not for another 50 years from this point here. So, in 1916, we get the the original founding of the United States National Park Service, and Stephen Tyne Mather, essentially what we would call today like a self-made billionaire. He was like a multi-millionaire, but back then each dollar bought a lot more. He starts the National Park Service and standardizes things like uniforms and takes over from organizations like the United States Cavalry, state organizations, and sort of the loose cobbling together of park rangers without any centralized direction or organization, and really turns being a conservationist, a ranger, a person who covers the range of a place on patrol and to manage and guide it. He turns that into a profession. He codifies what are the principles by which we're going to do this stuff. He's answering the why question, because at this formative stage in national parks, we don't have any of that why stuff yet. It just doesn't exist. At this point, it's just a bunch of custodial effort. That is, being assigned a chunk of land and trying to take care of it, but not really with any long-term vision for it. It's just like, let's make sure the wheels stay on for this visitor season, and we'll get to next visitor season. Okay? So we'd call that a custodial approach. And what that means is there's a lot of space beyond that for charting a path forward, charting a way through what is going to, in the next 50 years, be an absolute literal exponential explosion of growth in population and in parks. Okay? So in more urban areas like New York and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and San Francisco, where a chunk of our American population, places like Chicago, St. Louis, a huge chunk of our population, right? The big migration from farms to city life is starting in this time. Like the wholesale migration of folks away from the family farm. We don't really have big industrial farms as run by Monsanto or ConAgra, places like that yet. But people are having a lot of kids. Life expectancy is rocketing upward, and so there's not necessarily sort of a sustainable place for everybody on farms, and so people migrate to cities. So in this time we have the progressive era. This is kind of the first time in American history where progressive reformers are taking things like a close look at public health. It's really just before this time, in the late 1800s, that we figure out that, hey, germs are a thing, and germs in our water, not a good thing. So, let's clean our public water supplies. And who's going to be able to do that? Government institutions and organizations, providing basic, safe water to drink by regulating things like wells, setting up things like water treatment plants that we don't really think about today, but somebody had to figure out, hey, if half our population is dying of cholera and dysentery, maybe that's kind of a drag, and with a little bit of public effort, everybody paying a little bit of tax into the common pot, we can all have safe drinking water, stuff like that. So basic health regulation. That takes a public-facing direction with the establishment of reform parks. So a lot of city parks were established in this time as cities are rapidly growing. Areas of what are getting incorporated into the cities as they grow outward are set aside as not just like city parks, but specifically reform parks. So this is when, around the time when organizations like the YMCA, the YWCA, Young Men's Christian Organization, Young Women's Christian Organization, setting up things like reform parks. So it's not just a place to go frisbee golfing with your dog, it's a place to go every morning, 6 days out of 7 of the week, and take like a public free Pilates class, that kind of a thing. Because if everybody's a little bit healthier, then everybody can maybe work a little bit more, and society is a little bit better off for it. So this is the time when people are batting around ideas like, to what extent does the government tackle stuff like public health? We have things like the Spanish flu about to hit around, right at the end of World War I. American soldiers are going to bring the Spanish flu over to Europe. It's going to kill a bunch of people, and then they're going to bring it back to the United States, and it's going to be one of the first global pandemics to fully circle the globe with all of those troop movements associated with World War I. And so in light of that, people are asking questions like, okay, so with pandemics, what does anybody do about that? Public health, epidemiology, these fields of the study of spread of disease, for example, they're starting around this time. And it's pretty crude work at that early stage, right? So people still, in large part, believe in really pretty superstitious things about health. Our long and valuable tradition of having a ton of immigrants coming in means that all sorts of beliefs about how to make water safe to drink, what is, do evil spells exist? Is that a thing? Is that a public health concern, right? This is like an open question in the early 1900s, okay? And then we get the Great Depression. On Black Friday in 1929, the stock market crashes and sets off a global depression economically. And so in response to that, we get folks like the second Roosevelt president starting these huge federal and then 50 state versions of these programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, to do things like get a whole bunch of able-bodied young people, mostly all men. At that point, there's a strong gender divide in society and who could do what work. And set up organizations like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that did, among other things, build Giant City State Park Lodge and a whole bunch of trails and stonework. Did you know this? Over at Touch of Nature. There's a whole bunch of 100-year-old CCC built stuff just kind of hiding in the forest at Touch of Nature. It's really cool to go explore there off trail. If you decide to explore off trail at Touch of Nature, be safe. Go with somebody, let somebody know where you're going in case you bust an ankle or something, or find a pit viper, okay? So we get the Civilian Conservation Corps essentially building out the first generation of like park-owned and run facilities, like lodges, cafeterias, a whole bunch of trails. There's all these really cool archival photos of Buffalo soldiers or African American soldiers following the Civil War, dynamiting in a whole bunch of trails up cliff faces at some of our most famous national parks, building early park buildings and stuff like that. But building out parks really starts to explode after we get the Great Depression, and we have thousands and thousands and thousands of young people that are basically going to starve if they're not at these work camps. So 3/4 of your paycheck of like dozens of dollars, dozens of them, gets sent back to your family wherever they are, and you live in a big bunkhouse that you helped build, and the food isn't great, but there's plenty of it, and you are building stuff by a whole bunch of manual labor. So miles and miles of trails, huge stick-built log structures like Giant City Lodge, dry mason and stonework, masonry work as well, happening through the Works Progress Administration, CCC, and then rural electrification throughout this area and east of us with the Tennessee Valley Authority. A lot of people are, in the early 1900s, still living in non-electrified, no public water service, no internet or cellular, because that doesn't exist yet, in places like rural Kentucky. And without big federal projects to build things like the dams on the Gully River of West Virginia, the Youghiogheny River, the Wild Rivers of the East, the Chattooga, places like that, which are super awesome for whitewater rafting now, downstream of those dams, because they open up the dam floodgates and you go whitewater rafting down those floodwaters. Pretty cool stuff. That's all happening here in the 1930s. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt kicks off the golden age of conservation in the interwar period between World War I, which ends right before 1920, and right before World War II, which starts for the United States in, the mid-1940s, okay? So in this time, we have pretty well established the continental 48 United States. We have a lot of prosperity in the roaring 20s to set things in motion, and then huge federal investments to build out parks after Stephen Mather gets the Park Service kind of bootstrapped up from nothing. And a lot of early stuff is built in this time. Really cool stuff. In 1937, at the height of the Great Depression, we have this kind of interesting dude, Benton MacKaye, is thinking, wow, this, as it turns out, poverty is this horribly stressful and grinding and soul-crushing thing to endure. Wouldn't it be cool if we could take some of our public lands in places that aren't really being heavily used, like along the top of the Appalachian Ridgeline, where it's basically impossible to do any kind of sustainable farming, stuff like that. Wouldn't it be cool if, if you were kind of hungry, you could just walk up onto the mountaintop and hang out at a little, basically like an early commune, and it's got a real big vegetable garden, and you don't have to pay anything to exist to be there. you can just show up, and if you're willing to help out with some gardening, you can grow your own food. And when the view gets kind of samey after a while, maybe walk along the ridgeline 30, 40, 50 miles to the next one. Get a different view for a little while, help out with that garden, maybe build some shelter structures and stuff like that so you're not freezing to death. Wouldn't that be cool? And as it turns out, trying to garden on top of a mountain ridgeline, not the most feasible idea. But it did sort of lay the groundwork. People were like, okay, dumb idea, but it'd be cool to like string a trail across those places and have that available for folks to walk along. So the Appalachian Trail starts to form as an idea. And we have, in 1937, a National Park Service that is now just old enough to drink. It's 21 years old. So let's see if the federal government could string together basically a real long, skinny national park that crosses 14 different states. So the states aren't going to be able to do this kind of thing, but the federal government might be able to marshal the resources to do it. And so they do. The National Park Service takes over what will later evolve into the formally established National Trail System. So the NTS is part of the 400 plus units that the National Park Service manages. And the National Trail System includes national scenic trails, like the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail, which goes from Montana through Colorado down to the southern border. It's about, 3,500 miles long. It also has national historic trails, like the Lewis and Clark Trail. You may have heard of them. And you can go sort of retrace their route. You can walk along basically the route that they took from St. Louis out to the Pacific Northwest. There are also national recreation trails, which aren't quite as scenic, not quite as historic, but man, you can sure do a whole bunch of like more hardcore recreation-y stuff along the national recreation trails. So even that idea had to sort of be invented whole cloth. Nobody really had a national trails system. Nobody had a federal government apparatus to manage across multiple states, or in the European Union, multiple small state-sized countries before. So this is the time period in which these crazy ideas, we just kind of throw a bunch of ideas at the wall and see what sticks, you know? Also at this time, John D. Rockefeller Jr. is now old enough to take over administrating part of his father's just mind-bogglingly huge fortune. And this is when the Rockefeller family starts to buy up a whole bunch of land and kind of sit on it and start donating it, kind of feeding it area by area to the National Park Service as the Park Service is able to slowly catch up and take over those permanently to run them as national park units as well. Now, they're not all national parks. Some of them will get incorporated into national parks, but stuff like the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Memorial Parkway, which is like too many syllables, it's not really a national park, but it sure does a great job of stringing together Yellowstone and Tetons so that they can be managed more ecologically as a unit instead of big squares and rectangles on the map that are disconnected from any kind of reality on the ground, right? The bison don't need squares closed in by barbed wire fences to freeze to death against. They need connected landscapes to migrate across. So this is where the Rockefellers are able to help for the good of all American people in this way. They also did stuff like at Acadia National Park, also one of the first national parks, and established right around the time that the National Park Service itself was created. Mount Desert Island, it's a horseshoe-shaped island, it's about 75,000 acres, and it's just a sort of upside-down U-shaped thing, or lowercase n-shaped thing. It's an island off the coast of Maine. It's like 100 yards off the coast of Maine, it's not way off in the ocean. Like there's a bridge to it, no big deal. The Rockefellers own like half of that island. And like a third of the island is set aside as Acadia National Park. And the Rockefellers are like, you know what? We've paid like $1 million back in the day, which is way more money than it is now. We've paid to create like 50 or 100 miles of these beautiful stonework carriage roads, like hand-laid granite blocks, thousands and thousands of these granite stones quarried from nearby, and it's all beautifully maintained and graded. You can go on recreational carriage rides. It's not this horrible, super bumpy, muddy mess. We'll give to the American people, for everyone's enjoyment, like 95% of these carriage roads. We're just going to hang on to a couple of ginormous estates kind of on the sea cliff coast of this island, and we'll enjoy just that last 5% ourselves and our descendants. And yeah, National Park Service, if you're willing to help us maintain this stuff, everybody can use them. And that's exactly what the National Park Service agreed to do. And so as a result, you and I and everybody else, we can go live like a Rockefeller for a while at Acadia National Park on our vacation. You can hire a horse-drawn carriage, and it's literally like riding around in a Cinderella fairy tale wonderland kind of a thing. It's all these beautiful mountain peaks, and you're getting conveyed by this beautiful horse-drawn carriage, and maybe the carriage driver or coachman is interested in telling you about the history of the area, interpreting a bunch of stuff to you. Or maybe you're just like, you know what, Jeeves, just drive us along while we canoodle under this blanket together. We'll have our mulled wine, and we'll stop at some vistas and take selfies because we're lonely and crushed inside. Anyway, maybe that's just me. Anyway, so there's this like public-private partnership thing happening. Right? Stephen Tying Mather funds the Park Service out of pocket for the first several years. The Rockefeller family, low-key buying up land all over the country, like huge amounts of land, and just giving it to the federal government, but for the benefit and enjoyment of all people, not really for the benefit of the government, and stuff like that. Okay? So this is a strange and interesting time, but this is still largely a custodial phase. The Park Service is still getting stood up on its own 2 feet and figuring out, how do we park ranger? Because they had to kind of invent this from whole cloth. So you get a lot of photos like this. This is Stephen Mather and a couple of other folks. I believe Gifford Pinchot is in this photo as well. And this is part of how people did parks back then. Like, let's set a dinner table with a tablecloth in the middle of the forest with full dinner service, which is a fancy way of saying like a salad fork and a dessert spoon up top, right? And work from the outside in, okay? Like, this is part of legit how people figured, okay, well, rich people back in the 1700s, royalty did it this way, so let's, I guess, do it like that. I don't know what to do with my hands here, but we'll look busy anyway. Right? So, we're still kind of figuring all this stuff out less than 100 years ago now, which is strange to think about. And then, like, the full-on Great Depression hits, and for everybody who's not kind of independently wealthy and able to access national parks with table service, we have tens of thousands of people living full-time in national parks and what will become Shawnee National Forest and places like that, where you lose your job, you lose your house, maybe you got your Model T Ford, and you're living out of it full-time. This says #van life, but like not for the cloud. It's so you don't starve to death and freeze to death. So there's all these archival photos of people like fishing to catch dinner in the Merced River in Yosemite National Park. Whereas now, you can be there for up to 2 weeks at a time, and then you gotta find another place to go so that folks aren't low-key living in Yosemite Valley because there's just not enough space for that anymore, okay? So, the rest of us are kind of back to the old Sherwood Forest mode of, yeah, we're living off of this land because we kind of have to. There's just not a lot of other options in the worst, sort of deepest, darkest part of the Great Depression, okay? So we have the Farm Security Administration, the Office of War Information. Like, everybody is trying to get everybody to understand how people are actually living and surviving and putting together a day-to-day kind of thing. So this sequence of photos up here is in the run-up to America's active entrance into World War II. So this is beyond the Lend-Lease program of giving the Russians and like the British and stuff like that a whole bunch of free tanks and stuff like that. This is post Pearl Harbor and building out America's wartime infrastructure real fast because, my God, the Japanese have reached our territorial shores. Very scary stuff at that time. Okay, so we have steam power built dams. The Hoover Dam is going up at this time. Glen Canyon Dam is going up at the big time. At this time, these are the largest human creations, the largest modern constructed structures in the world of all time, except for basically the Great Pyramids and the Great Wall of China. Okay? So this is all happening during the Great Depression. It was the Great Depression right up until the first American troop landed and started pulling triggers at Normandy and Omaha. Okay? Normandy Beach, Omaha Beach, D-Day invasion. Okay? So this is how a lot of people live, and this is cane pole fishing. We're a bit of a ways off from modern carbon fiber and fiberglass fly rods with fiber optic sights. I don't know, everything else in hunting and fishing has fiber optic sights. Why not fishing poles too? I don't know, but I'm joking. I'm not joking. Okay. But this is how 85 to 100 years ago your great-great-grandparents lived and had fun. This is recreation for the rest of us, the non-independently wealthy. Okay? This photo was taken less than 150 miles from where we are right now. People living in honest-to-God log cabins, hand-built. Okay? Now that might be sort of the forestry major wet dream of, yeah, I'm totally gonna homestead and like grow all my own stuff. We're gonna live off the grid. We're preppers, man. All right? When the Golden Horde comes starving out of the city for us after the EMPs go off, we're ready. We've been stockpiling ammo so much that our house is tilted towards that side because ammo's heavy. All right? But this is like, okay, we don't have any money, but we got a saw. Let's make a house. All right? Modern food preservation technology, canning. This is a young technology at this point. This is the new hotness. This was the Keurig of their day, right? We had to figure out stuff like, if the can is bulging a little bit, botulism, don't eat that. Okay. And this is also the period in the 1930s and early 1940s where folks like P.T. Barnum and Bailey's Circus, is bringing to people a vision, or at least a construction, of nature and wildlife species and sort of non-typical human phenotypes, conjoined twins, intersex people, stuff like that, like the freak show, as it was called back then at the circus. Teddy the wrestling bear, right? This is people's understanding of a bear. This is most people's understanding of a bear at this time. Okay. And this is the Porsche Taycan of its day. Okay. So, a lot of people in the 1940s still going by horse and buggy. We don't have the interstate system at all. Most state highways and federal highways up to this point are one lane each way and not built for high-speed transport. So a lot of people, again, not getting to these national parks or forests because they're pretty far away and we're all just trying not to starve right now in the first place. Okay? So that takes us up to World War II, and the focus for America at that time isn't really going to be recreation, as we're trying not to get blown up by the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge and so on and so forth. Have you guys seen the old HBO miniseries Band of Brothers? Okay, people getting blown up on screen and stuff like that, but, you know, war fighting. Before we have, who's that guy, Ghost in the first-person shooter game? Is that Modern Warfare or Call of Duty, something like that, you know? Now it's like, base actual, we are RTB. Like, now it's cool and hip, and you pay $70 for an overpriced video game that's the same thing with more detailed textures that they've been releasing for the past 20 years. Back then, a little bit different, right? They had penicillin, which was nice. Now we've got ACOGs and drones and everything else. Kind of a different vibe. Anyway, moving on from World War II. We have a shift from the custodial phase of the 1930s where the federal government is building out stuff while people can't afford to get to parks and forests. We move into the so-called confrontation phase. So, with the start of the Great Depression through the mid-1960s, we're going to have the government providing a whole bunch of service and construction and infrastructure and land acquisition or land designation as parks and national forests, national grasslands, national seashores, national et cetera, right? The system is growing rapidly here. But in this time, especially after World War II, when the soldiers come home and start making tons and tons of babies, the baby boomer generation, your grandparents, we have people starting to take a look at all the decisions the government has made, the direction that the National Park Service, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, at that time what was called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Mines, and crucially the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which manages a metric hecton of recreation lands and surface waters and surface lands in the United States around military bases and big water projects like locks and dams and all of that. Some people are starting to disagree with kind of the momentum the big federal government is gathering in the direction that things are going. So this is going to push us into, as use is growing literally exponentially in this time, like this is a parabolic growth, so it's use is escalating with the square of the time passing up through about 1970. So we're having a doubling of people showing up to parks every decade. Okay. Twice as tall bar here, twice as tall bar in the 1960s, about twice as tall in 1970, and then things start to level off. But at that time, it's this meteoric rise, and there's no slowdown visible from the 1960s. So we're going to get into a time of a lot of people pushing back on federal ideas about how to do this stuff, and we'll see a bunch of legislation that kind of is a right turn on how parks, forests, other public lands, including stuff run for recreation and wildlife conservation purposes, how those things are going to get run is going to shift pretty hard starting in the 50s and really coming to fruition in the 1960s. So let's take a look at that. All right, we have, let's see if this video actually is going to play. It is not. This is a really cool time lapse of Yosemite Valley if you want to download this presentation and copy that URL. Pretty neat stuff. Those big capital projects, Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, those are millions of cubic meters of concrete, and they take some decades to get going, and in some cases take decades to finish curing. Like, imagine a chemical reaction in the foundation of your house taking decades to finish, while you need that house to not take decades to become habitable, right? So these are the scale of some of these big capital projects. All right, so starting in 1960s, we start seeing this confrontation between public sensation of how things should be going, what do we want from our public lands, versus what the federal government is able and willing and sort of managing towards. Okay. We've got the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, MUSIA. And for the Forest Service, this is a half century after the Forest Service is created, back in the time of the first Roosevelt president. It takes us basically 50 years to figure out, okay, so what's the Forest Service's mission? Like, what do we actually mean? Like, okay, we all agree that it's good to have a mission as a forester. Like, where are we going to steer the ship? It took us 50 years to, like, figure that out, right? Like, how to actually enact utilitarian benefit for all people. How to enact that conservation approach to things, right? Conservation all sounds well and good, and everybody's kind of for it. There's not a lot of people, at least, who are going to say the quiet part out loud of, no, let's pillage this land and cash that check and laugh all the way to the bank and screw everybody else. Most folks are like, yeah, no, I like clean drinking water and affordable toilet paper and etc. So it takes us to the 1960s. It takes us the research of people like Aldo Leopold, essentially one of the first wildlife biologists, and his son, his descendant A. Starker Leopold, writing the Leopold Report to help us understand, okay, if we hunt out all of the predators, that's going to mean problems for us. And now, almost a century after Aldo Leopold and so forth, we're finally effectively getting back into large carnivore reintroduction and rebreeding techniques and deployment of that stuff. We're now finally into a fully functional bison reintroduction and elk reintroduction, etc., kind of a program. But along the way, we get stuff like MUSIA to sort of make explicit, okay, when we say conservation, this is now what we actually mean. Forest Service do all of these things. You got to check all of these boxes, and you can't check all of them at 100%. So optimize for the highest across all of these for the longest period of time for the most people. Okay? So timber, rangeland, because we all like burgers, except for those of us who don't. Recreation is a top shelf use of forest, right along there with timber extraction. And that has effects on you and me as we go to recreate on the Shawnee, because a bunch of timber extraction for the past 30 years has been blocked by lawsuits and is just now getting started again, okay? Watershed, clean watersheds. If you're a forester, obviously these days with our modern SIU Forestry SAF accredited program, second or third largest in the country, we're kind of a big deal. Like, we have a whole specialization for forest watershed management, right? And it's the hard one. You gotta take all the calculus classes for that specialization. But that's cool, because calc is love, calc is life. Just kidding. I hated all the calculus classes I had to take as a chemistry major. But watersheds now, for the first time, are important and threatened enough to have to be managed by a large federal land management organization like the United States Forest Service, so that local municipalities who are getting their water supplies from watersheds on federal land, so that they have any chance against General Dynamics. Think about this. Right after World War II, it was observed that, oh goodness, the Russians, the Soviet Russians, are building the bomb. And we just used a couple of bombs, our two prototypes, the only two we had at that time, against Japan to end the Pacific War. This is probably bad that Russia is, kind of close to Alaska. Sarah Palin says, we can see it from my backyard. What do we do with that? We should probably build our ammunition and war material making factories, so making our beams, our bullets, and our bandages, and our tanks, and our strategic bombers and stuff like that, we should make those away from the coasts, because the coasts are going to get torched first. Or nuked off the face of the planet first. So, what is now Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge was first a huge ammunition manufacturing operation, now run by General Dynamics. It's still ongoing. There are huge sections of Crab Orchard that are totally off limits, right? So if you're the town of Heron or Carterville or Carbondale, and our watersheds, our water supply, are right off of water that was dammed up to help aid ammunition manufacturing, which causes lots and lots and lots of heavy metal contamination to watersheds nearby based on how they did manufacturing in the 1950s and 60s. That's a problem. Let's wrap that heavy industrial and its contaminant plume manufacturing operation with the National Wildlife Refuge. And let's put an advisory that if you're pregnant, don't eat more than one of these fish out of these lakes a month. Okay? Those advisories are going to come much later, after your parents are born. Think about that for a second. Right? Like if your parents are just like pants on head, dumb sometimes, ask them how much lead their parents ate. Anyway, whatever. Totally unrelated. Also by this time, we have the Tennessee Valley Authority setting up lots and lots and lots of coal-fired power plants across the Midwest. And with coal-fired power plants at that time, before we have the Clean Air Act, coming up in the 1970s, we're gonna have a whole lot of mercury, which is extremely toxic, going out of those smokestacks as one byproduct of burning coal, and a whole bunch of nickel, and a whole bunch of other metals like cobalt coming out as trace amounts, but coming out of those smoke plumes kind of day and night. And a little bit over a long period of time is a lot of that little bit, okay? So let's wrap some federal watershed protection upwind and downwind of these areas and marshal some federal resources to help the municipality of Carterville and Heron and Carbondale have any chance at clean water. Okay, so protect the habitat and also pour some funding into stuff like primary, secondary, and tertiary water treatment to help pull out heavy metals where they are found. Okay. A couple years later, we get an awesome rock star of a lady researcher in a time when women were not super prevalent in the sciences yet. A gal named Rachel Carson. She is the GOAT. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, I mean like greatest of all time. She writes this book, Silent Spring. I have 2 first edition copies of Silent Spring in my office if you want to thumb through them. It's basically a book that says, hey guys and gals, the way that we are doing our industrial agriculture now, having taken a whole bunch of super secret Nazi explosives research on manufacturing nitrogenous compounds, pulling nitrogen out of the air and turning it into bombs so that the Germans can launch their lightning war, their blitzkrieg. That's pretty cool. It's leading to the Green Revolution. It's going to lead to a couple of billion people over the next couple of decades not starving to death around the world because we can now make synthetic fertilizers. But with those synthetic fertilizers, we're also starting to field things like DDT, synthetic pesticides, that are really effective but have some side effects. And so Silent Spring is a reference to, we've got grains that are not eaten by different mealworms and stuff like that, moths or whatever. But at the same time, it's killing all the birds. And it's killing all the insects that the birds are trying to eat. And it's also getting into stuff like, and this is awkward, but we're all adults, it's starting to accumulate in stuff like human breast milk, and maybe that's bad. So Rachel Carson starts to sound the alarm and basically kicks off what you and I now understand to be the environmental movement, asking not a question of what is absolutely at the limit of what we can possibly do with all of our new chemistry based out of wartime research. What is the limit of what we can possibly do in terms of absolutely maximal food production and minimal food spoilage and wastage, into something more like, what can we sustain with that? Like, we need to be able to produce food and not have it eaten up by vermin. And at the same time, we need to have breast milk that's not, it doesn't have that like that tangy taste of pesticides in it, you know, for your little babies, because it's building up in their bodies too. So the modern equivalent of the conversation that Rachel Carson started was the question, how much nanoplastic in your brain is too much? Because it's there, and it has an effect on your brain tissue. It has an effect on your other organs as well, right? Plastics, some microplastics are identified as things like endocrine disruptors, or they trigger inflammatory cytokine responses, so like autoimmune diseases and stuff like that. And Rachel Carson was basically the person that, with a beautifully researched and substantiated book like this, nobody could really point a finger at Rachel Carson and be like, fake news. She was like, no, I'm a biologist, I'm a researcher. This is what I and a whole bunch of other people doing responsible, right out in the open, clear research and good, well-designed stuff, this is what we're finding. And this is what things are gonna trend towards if we keep on this kind of profit and growth at all costs for all time approach of Western capitalist society. Okay, so as a result of stuff like this, we get the Rockefellers getting more involved with things, and other prominent families like them. We get the ORRC a little bit later on trying to figure out, okay, so our environmental impacts are stacking up what it looks like an exponential rate. So is our population, and so is use of our national treasures, our parks and forests and so forth. Where are we going? What's our trajectory with this? Are we really gonna like exponentially grow? Like, how much, thanks to this A. Starker Leopold guy and Aldo Leopold, we have this idea of carrying capacity. What's the carrying capacity of our parks? Like, how many humans per square, not per square acre, that's dumb. How many humans per acre or per hectare can Shawnee National Forest, once it's formed 30 years later, can it sustain? You know, can we have 1,000 people per acre? Or is that not a great idea? Can we have only 1 or 0.01 person per acre sustainably? The ORRC was an early effort to try and figure that stuff out, because again, in the 1900s, we're not really tracking this stuff very well. We don't even really know at a lot of our parks how many people are even showing up year on year. We just know that it's kind of busy sometimes, right? Nobody's actually counting heads yet in some places. And then in the mid-1960s, really starting in the 1950s, a bunch of Forest Service folks up in like Wisconsin and Minnesota, where the big southern boreal forest is starting to be kind of under pressure for like wide-scale, clear-cut logging. And some of these guys and gals are thinking, you know, this is, like, I get it, we need board feet, right? The situation hasn't changed for the past 60 years since Gifford Pinchot, but man, it'd be such a waste. Like, there are so many good places like the American Southeast nobody cares about, like Georgia, to grow lots of cheap pine, nice and straight and tall and fast. What if we set aside some of these places that will become spots like the Boundary Waters Canoe area? Anybody ever been up there? Or like Wisconsin Dells, places like that, like really beautiful northern areas? What if we just set some of these aside, like core habitat areas? It's an idea that showed up in the Forest Service and took about 10 years to hit the popular consciousness. And then Congress was like, okay, fine. You can carve out wilderness areas from national forests and national parks and, keep them primitive. We'll never log those. All right, we'll stop right there, and we'll return on Tuesday. See you then. I'm around for questions, and I'll post our class recordings so you can study for our quiz, our one-question quiz, at the end of class on Tuesday.